welcome. And I want to speak directly to you right now.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this in early March of 2026, you are currently living through one of the most intense, rapid, and really unprecedented global shockwaves in modern history.
Absolutely unprecedented.
Right. Whether you are frantically checking your stock portfolio, staring in total disbelief at the price of gas at your local station, or you're just trying to make sense of the absolute barrage of breaking news alerts lighting up your phone right now.
Overwhelming.
It is. But this deep dive is built specifically for you. 2 weeks ago, almost no one saw this coming. Today, the entire world is holding its breath.
The velocity of this escalation is what makes it so historic.
Yeah.
We are navigating a situation that fundamentally alters the global landscape. And the ripple effects are already touching every single corner of the globe, from the commodity markets in London to the shipping lanes of the Pacific.
So our mission today is to cut through the incredible fog of war. Over the past few days, we have been compiling and analyzing a massive stack of sources.
Hours and hours of footage.
Exactly. Specifically, we're looking at in-depth video interviews and briefings from globally recognized geopolitical analysts, military strategists, and economic forecasters from the very first days of this month, March 2026.
Right.
What they are detailing is a rapidly expanding, monumental conflict in the Middle East involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, it's a massive conflagration.
But before we get into the weeds, I want to establish the absolute rules of engagement for this deep dive. We are not taking sides.
No.
We are not doing political spin. There are plenty of places on the internet you can go for that. What we are doing here is a rigorous, entirely impartial breakdown of the facts on the ground.
Just the data.
Right. The military strategies at play and the severe global implications for the coming weeks. We're looking at the raw reality of the situation.
If I can offer an anchoring thought as we begin to navigate this immense amount of information,
Please.
it is vital to understand that this is not just another regional flare-up. The analysts we've been reviewing emphasize over and over that what we are witnessing is a fundamental structural stress test.
A stress test of the whole system.
Exactly. Of the entire global economy, of the emerging multipolar geopolitical order, and of the very fabric of international alliances. The daily outcomes of the military engagements, while tragic, are almost secondary to the colossal economic and diplomatic realignments occurring in real time beneath the surface.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. Let's go back to the catalyst. February 28, 2026.
The day it started.
Right. The United States and Israel launch a massive, coordinated, preemptive military campaign. The official designation was Operation Epic Fury.
Epic Fury.
Multiple analysts have described it as the largest regional operation since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So let's look at the strategic rationale here.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Because I was watching these briefings, and it seems like Washington and Jerusalem are operating on two completely different timelines regarding why this happened right now. Break down the logic for me.
Sure. The divergence in strategic rationale is one of the most fascinating aspects of the initial strike. If we look at the statements and the analytical breakdowns of the posture coming from U.S. leadership.
Specifically President Donald Trump.
Right, specifically President Trump. The argument is firmly, almost exclusively, rooted in immediate tactical preemption.
Okay, tactical preemption.
Yeah. The stated intelligence assessment broadcast to the world was that Israel was preparing to initiate strikes of its own accord. And the U.S. intelligence apparatus concluded that the moment Israel acted, Iran would automatically and massively retaliate against American forces and bases across the entire region.
So the American logic was essentially, the dominoes are already falling, we have to strike the board.
Precisely that. The logic presented was that by striking first, alongside Israel in a coordinated fashion, the U.S. could severely degrade Iran's ability to launch those retaliatory strikes.
Right.
It was framed as a defensive necessity to an imminent threat. The goal was to destroy the launchers before the missiles could be fueled and fired, thereby preventing much higher American casualties at bases in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf.
But then you listen to the Israeli perspective, specifically the public statements from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Very different tone.
Completely different. He wasn't just talking about preempting an attack that week. He framed this in a much grander, almost historical context. He stated that this operation fulfills a 40-year objective.
And that is the crucial distinction that every analyst is highlighting right now. For the Israeli leadership, this is not merely a tactical preemption to save troops in the short term.
Right.
It is the sudden realization of a decades-long strategic vision. The stated objective from Jerusalem is to fundamentally and permanently reshape the security architecture of the Middle East.
What does reshaping the architecture actually mean in practical terms, though?
It means total elimination of a peer rival.
Wow.
Yeah. It means completely halting and physically dismantling Iran's nuclear program, erasing its ballistic missile capabilities, and severing its financial and logistical support for proxy militias across the region.
From Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen.
Exactly. It is about removing the primary counterweight to Israeli regional hegemony. When you combine those two distinct rationales,
The short-term U.S. goal and the long-term Israeli goal.
right, the U.S. desire for immediate tactical preemption of a specific attack and Israel's drive for the long-term strategic elimination of a rival state.
Yeah.
You get the sheer unprecedented scale of Operation Epic Fury.
It wasn't designed to send a message.
No, it was designed to break the state.
And the scale is just staggering. We're talking about a decapitation strike of proportions we really haven't seen in modern statecraft.
Unprecedented.
The targets weren't just radar dishes out in the remote desert. The briefings we reviewed confirm the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Yes.
And it wasn't a surgical strike that only got him. Reports indicate his family members, including his wife, who later succumbed to her injuries, his daughter, and several grandchildren were killed in the massive strikes on his compound in Tehran.
And the military leadership as well.
Right. Alongside them, the strikes wiped out a massive swath of the top military brass. The defense minister, the head of the supreme leader's military office, the police intelligence chief, and the absolute top-tier Revolutionary Guard commanders.
They hit everything at once.
They even struck the Assembly of Experts compound in Qom, which is the very body constitutionally tasked with choosing the supreme leader.
The targeting matrix was clearly designed to instantly paralyze the Iranian state apparatus. They went after the absolute apex of political, religious, and military authority simultaneously.
To sever the head from the body.
Exactly. The logic of a decapitation strike is to sever the head, assuming the body will then flounder and collapse. But they didn't stop at the leadership. They simultaneously targeted the physical, economic, and technological infrastructure of state power.
I saw the satellite imagery breakdowns of the nuclear sites.
Newtown.
Yeah, the Natanz enrichment facility. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, confirmed it had its deeply buried entrances heavily bombed to trap whatever was inside.
Right.
They hit the port of Bandar Abbas, which is a vital economic and naval hub on the coast, setting key naval vessels and loading docks ablaze.
And the media.
Yes, the IRB. Iran's massive state broadcasting headquarters right in the middle of Tehran, presumably to plunge the airwaves into silence and stop the government from communicating with its populace.
Cut off all communication.
But the human toll of all this firepower, the footage and reports are devastating. The sources detail severe civilian impacts that go way beyond collateral damage.
It's horrific.
We are talking about strikes hitting the Gandhi and Khatam Ambiya hospitals. There are horrifying corroborated reports of a strike on a school that killed 108 children.
Just awful.
And then there's the specific tactic used in densely populated areas like Nalofa Square in Tehran, the double taps.
Yeah, the reports regarding the use of double-tap bombings are deeply alarming and form a significant part of the global condemnation we are seeing.
Break that down for me.
For those unfamiliar with the terminology, a double tap is a specific calculated operational tactic, and an initial strike is carried out on a target. Then there is a deliberate delay.
Usually time to wait for people to arrive.
Exactly. Usually time for exactly when emergency services, medics, firefighters, and civilian bystanders have rushed into the rubble to help the wounded and pull people out.
God.
Once that dense crowd of first responders is clustered at the site, a second strike hits the exact same location.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around the psychology of ordering something like that.
The accounts from witnesses detailed by the analyst are incredibly grim, describing scenes of absolute carnage, severed limbs, and massive concentrated casualties among the very people trying to save lives.
Right.
Militarily, the brutal logic is that you eliminate the enemy's ability to recover and respond by killing their emergency infrastructure.
Yeah.
Psychologically, it is a tactic designed to maximize damage and instill profound, paralyzing terror within a civilian population, making them afraid to help each other.
Because if you run into help, you're the next target.
Exactly. Over 800 people were reported killed in the first few days alone across Iran, a vast number of them civilians caught in these densely packed urban centers.
Okay, so you have this massive decapitation strike. The supreme leader is dead, the capital is burning, communications are disrupted, and the hospitals are overwhelmed.
Total chaos.
Right. If you look at traditional military doctrine, you would think the country would just collapse into total anarchy. The head is severed.
You would think so.
But the geopolitical analysts are pointing to a completely different reality on the ground. There's a power vacuum, sure, but it's not a complete void. Why didn't the state just shatter?
The core issue there is a fundamental Western misunderstanding of the institutional resilience of the Iranian system.
How so?
Yes, this is undeniably the most significant existential leadership crisis the Islamic Republic has faced since its founding in 1979. Khamenei had been in power since 1989. He was the ultimate arbiter of all state affairs, the center of gravity.
Right.
However, the system has built-in constitutional mechanisms for this exact, albeit extreme, scenario. The analysts point out that an interim leadership council immediately took over, projecting continuity.
Who is on that council?
It includes President Masoud Pezeshkian, the Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohseni AJ, and the influential Khoureya Alireza Arafi.
So they essentially formed an emergency triumvirate to keep the lights on and project stability to the public.
They did. But the political leadership is really only half the equation. The more critical factor in why the state didn't shatter is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC.
Ah, okay.
The IRGC maintains a deeply entrenched, highly cohesive, and purposely decentralized command structure. While they lost extremely senior commanders in the initial strikes, the operational capacity of the IRGC.
The actual weapons and soldiers.
Right, particularly its vast missile and drone forces. It was explicitly designed over decades to survive decapitation.
How does that work in practice? If the general in Tehran is dead, who gives the order to fire?
It operates much like a starfish.
A starfish.
Yeah. If you sever a limb, the rest of the organism continues to function independently. The IRGC utilizes a doctrine of pre-delegated launch authority.
Oh, wow.
Regional commanders and even individual base commanders deep in the mountains have the pre-authorized standing orders to launch their payloads if central communications are severed or if central leadership is wiped out.
So they don't even need to be told to fire. They just know.
Exactly. They operate with a degree of autonomy that allows them to continue fighting a coordinated war even if Tehran goes completely dark. The regime's survival instinct is paramount. And because of this decentralized structure, the decapitation strike didn't end the war, it simply removed the central off switch. They immediately framed this not as a defeat, but as a national resistance campaign, emphasizing a doctrine of maximum defiance.
Which perfectly explains why they didn't just fold. The sheer volume of firepower that came back the other way is staggering. The regime launched their retaliation, which they dubbed Operation True Promise 4.
True Promise 4, yes.
We are talking about a barrage of drone and ballistic missile strikes that instantly widened the theater of war. It wasn't just Iran shooting at Israel. It was Iran shooting at U.S. assets across the entire Middle East.
This is where we see the doctrine of asymmetric warfare fully deployed. And it is crucial to understand the mechanics of this strategy.
Break it down.
Iran knows perfectly well it cannot compete in a conventional jet fighter-to-jet fighter conflict with the United States and Israel. If they tried to fly their older jets against F-35s, they would be wiped out in hours.
No contest.
None. Therefore, their entire military strategy relies on two pillars: preserving their high-end, irreplaceable assets and aggressively exhausting the enemy's highly expensive resources.
Okay, let's talk about preserving assets first. I was looking at the intelligence estimates the analysts were citing, and they suggest Iran possesses an arsenal of around 2,500 to 3,000 ballistic missiles.
A massive stockpile.
How do you hide 3,000 massive missiles from the most advanced satellite network on Earth?
You bury them.
Literally.
Literally. To protect these arsenals from the exact kind of preemptive strike the U.S. just launched, Iran has spent decades burying them deep within subterranean mountain complexes, particularly in the rugged Zagros Mountains.
So not just throwing a tarp over them in a cave.
No, we are not talking about simple caves. These are literal missile cities, tunneled hundreds of feet deep underground, featuring blast doors, internal rail systems for moving launchers, and ventilation systems.
Wow.
They are heavily fortified against even advanced bunker-busting munitions, like the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators dropped by the B-2 bombers the U.S. has deployed.
So they are incredibly hard to hit.
Exactly. They roll the launcher to an opening, fire, and roll it back into the mountain before a retaliatory strike can hit the coordinates. It's an incredibly frustrating, high-stakes game of whack-a-mole for Western air forces.
And while they are hiding the good stuff, they are swarming the skies with the cheap stuff. I was watching a breakdown of the interceptor economics on one of these briefings, and my jaw hit the floor. Break down the math for me because it sounds totally unsustainable.
The economic asymmetry of this air war is perhaps Iran's most potent weapon right now. Iran is launching waves upon waves of relatively cheap, mass-produced weapons.
Like the drones.
Right, consider the Shahed drones, which we've seen utilized heavily and effectively in other global conflicts recently. Depending on the variant, these cost roughly $20,000 to $50,000 to manufacture.
That's practically nothing in military terms.
They're basically flying mopeds with explosives. Iran is launching these in massive swarms alongside older, less accurate liquid-fueled ballistic missiles.
And the sole purpose of launching those isn't necessarily to hit a target, but to force the U.S. to shoot them down.
Exactly. It's an exhaustion strategy. To shoot down a $20,000 drone or a basic cruise missile, the U.S. and Israel are forced to fire incredibly sophisticated interceptors. We are talking about the SM-3 missiles, which are launched from the vertical launch systems of U.S. naval destroyers positioned in the Red Sea and the Gulf. Or they're using the land-based THAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, and Patriot systems.
And what do those cost?
The economics are startling. A single SM-3 missile can cost upwards of $10 million to $20 million per shot.
$20 million to shoot down a $20,000 drone.
Yes. A single Patriot missile is roughly $4 million.
I heard one analyst use the analogy that it's like trying to swat a swarm of mosquitoes with a solid gold fly swatter. You might hit the mosquito, but you're going to go bankrupt doing it.
It is a painfully accurate analogy. The data we reviewed showed the U.S. spent over $1.5 billion on interceptors in just the first 4 days of this conflict.
In 4 days?
Yes. And the strategic issue isn't just a financial cost. It's the physical inventory. The Pentagon has already expressed profound concerns about depleting these interceptor stockpiles.
Because they just don't have infinite missiles.
Exactly. You cannot infinitely fire $10 million missiles at $20,000 drones without eventually running out of either money or missiles.
Yeah.
And right now, the physical stockpile of interceptors, how many are sitting in magazines on ships or in silos, is the pressing hard limit.
So Iran is doing the math.
Iran's explicit goal is to empty the magazines of the Western coalition with cheap decoys before they deploy their more advanced, harder to intercept, and far more destructive weapons.
And while this terrifying math is playing out in the sky, the geography of the war is exploding on the ground. The conflict instantly spilled across borders. It is a true regional conflagration.
It's everywhere.
The maps the analysts were showing of the strikes on U.S. bases, diplomatic outposts, and radar installations across multiple sovereign nations look like the entire region caught fire at once.
Absolutely.
We are talking about strikes in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, and remarkably, they even struck the UK's Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri in Cyprus.
The sheer breadth of the targeting is not random. It is a calculated diplomatic message. Iran is demonstrating in real time that any sovereign nation hosting U.S. or allied military assets used in this campaign is considered an active combatant and a legitimate target.
Wow, okay.
They were trying to force these host nations to evict the U.S. to save themselves. For instance, the analysts highlighted that the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, was hit by a drone, causing a major fire and forcing an immediate evacuation.
In Saudi Arabia?
Yes. Drones struck an Amazon cloud data center in the United Arab Emirates, highlighting the vulnerability of corporate infrastructure. The U.S. consulate in Dubai had a fire. A hotel in Bahrain housing U.S. personnel was hit. They even struck the French naval base in Abu Dhabi.
Nobody is safe.
No Western asset is considered off-limits.
The chaos of this battlefield must be unimaginable. There was this incredible, tragic detail in one of the reports about the absolute fog of war taking over the airspace.
The friendly fire incident?
Yes. Kuwaiti air defenses, presumably on high alert due to the incoming Iranian barrages crossing their airspace, accidentally engaged and shot down 3 U.S. F-15 fighter jets.
A total tragedy.
Let's pause on that. A friendly fire incident of that magnitude underscores just how panicked and saturated the airspace has become. How does something like that happen with modern technology?
It highlights the extreme cognitive and operational risk of a saturated airspace. Think about a radar operator sitting in a bunker in Kuwait. Their screen is flooded with hundreds of simultaneous tracks.
Right.
You have Shahed drones moving at 115 miles per hour. You have cruise missiles hugging the terrain. You have ballistic missiles re-entering the atmosphere at Mach 5.
And they all look like blips.
Exactly. And flying through all of this, you have U.S. and allied fighter jets trying to hunt the drones. Furthermore, the airspace is flooded with intense electronic warfare, jamming, and radar spoofing.
So the systems aren't even working properly.
Right. The IFF systems identify friend or foe, which are supposed to electronically ping a jet and confirm it's friendly, can be delayed, jammed, or misinterpreted in that environment. An operator has mere seconds to decide if a blip on a screen is an incoming Iranian cruise missile about to hit their city or a returning US F-15.
And they have to make the call.
In that sheer panic and cognitive overload, tragic, catastrophic mistakes happen.
And this chaos, this overextension of resources, is precisely the environment in which proxy forces thrive. Because Iran isn't fighting alone.
No, not at all.
The regional proxy network has mobilized entirely. Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, officially declared war on Israel. The briefing showed them launching massive, sustained rocket barrages into northern Israel, and in response, Israel initiated a new, heavy ground incursion into southern Lebanon.
Ordering troops to seize new positions.
Right, while heavily bombing the southern suburbs of Beirut, tens of thousands of civilians were displaced instantly.
And it extends beyond Lebanon. The Iraqi militias, heavily aligned with Iran, have activated. They have been launching dozens of drone and rocket attacks, targeting U.S. sites in Erbil and other locations in Iraq, forcing U.S. troops into bunkers constantly.
Constant pressure.
Even the Houthis in Yemen, while seemingly holding back from their most massive strikes immediately, have expressed total solidarity and are threatening to escalate attacks on the vital Red Sea choke points.
So it's a coordinated effort.
Iran's strategy for 2 decades has been to surround its adversaries with a ring of fire, and we are seeing the activation of that entire network simultaneously. They are fighting a decentralized, multi-front, multi-domain war specifically designed to stretch U.S. and Israeli resources, both military and psychological, to the absolute breaking point.
We've been looking at the skies and the ground, and the sheer scale of the violence is staggering. But the reality is, the first place most people listening to this are going to feel the impact of these strikes isn't on a battlefield, it's at the gas pump.
Absolutely.
Let's look at what happened to the global economic arteries. The most immediate severe global consequence of this conflict was the effective total closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is arguably the quintessential geographic choke point on the planet. For context, it is a remarkably narrow waterway separating Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles is nothing for a modern container ship.
Yeah, it's tiny. In normal times, roughly 20% of the world's global petroleum liquids consumption transits through this single, highly vulnerable strait. It is the absolute lifeblood of the global energy market, and Iran essentially controls the northern coastline.
And overnight, that lifeblood froze. The analysts paint a picture of an absolute logistical nightmare. Imagine this. Roughly 170 massive container ships, representing about 1.4% of the entire global shipping fleet, are currently trapped.
Just sitting there.
Half are stuck inside the Persian Gulf, unable to leave, and half are stacked up outside in the Arabian Sea, afraid to enter. And the reason isn't necessarily that Iran is shooting at every ship.
It's the money.
It's because the financial sector pulled the plug. The insurance companies halted all war risk coverage for vessels in the Persian Gulf.
The global shipping industry is entirely dependent on maritime insurance, much of it brokered through entities like Lloyd's of London. When a waterway becomes an active war zone with ballistic missiles flying overhead and naval assets being targeted, the insurers must reassess risk. Or risk premiums, which might normally be a fraction of a percent of a ship's whole value, suddenly spike to 5% or 10% if they're offered at all. If you have a vessel worth $100 million carrying $200 million in cargo,
you can't afford a 10% premium on that.
The insurance premium alone becomes economically ruinous. And if you simply can't insure the ship, the owners will not sail it, period.
So it's an instant, total paralysis of maritime trade in the region. The briefings noted that major global carriers like MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, and CGM immediately ordered all their ships to seek safe shelter and completely suspended all bookings for cargo bound for the Middle East.
A total halt.
And they're not just avoiding Hormuz, the fear has spread. They are completely rerouting away from the Suez Canal and the Red Sea entirely, opting instead for the massive historic detour around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
The cascading effects of that rerouting cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Sending a ship around the Cape of Good Hope adds weeks to transit times. It burns massive amounts of extra expensive fuel.
Yeah.
It requires more ships to maintain the same schedule, tightening global shipping capacity. It completely scrambles the delicate, just-in-time global supply chain. Ports in Europe suddenly go weeks without deliveries and then are overwhelmed when multiple delayed ships arrive at once.
But the immediate, visceral panic was felt in the energy markets. The shock was instantaneous. The economic data we reviewed showed Brent crude oil jumping over 15% in the first few days, hitting nearly $78 a barrel.
A huge spike.
But the natural gas numbers I saw coming out of Europe looked genuinely apocalyptic. European wholesale natural gas prices skyrocketed by an astonishing 131%.
That 131% spike is not some abstract figure moving on a trader's screen. It is a brutal, concrete reality.
It's what people pay to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It translates directly into the cost to heat a home during a cold snap, the cost to power a heavy industrial factory in Germany, and the cost to generate baseline electricity across the entire European continent. And the reasons for these spikes are highly concrete. It's not just the fear of the strait closing, it's the physical destruction of energy infrastructure happening on the ground.
Explain that.
The sources detail precise strikes on critical energy nodes. Massive fires broke out at Saudi Aramco refinery facilities after apparent Iranian drone strikes. Qatari liquefied natural gas, or LNG, production.
Which Europe desperately needs now.
Yes, which Europe relies on heavily since cutting off Russian gas. That was completely halted due to the strikes and airspace closures. Even operations at oil and gas fields in Iraqi Kurdistan and Israel were entirely shut down.
So you have the physical supply heavily constrained, and the maritime route to transport whatever fuel is left is completely blocked by insurers. And this is where the financial analysts in these briefings start sounding the alarm about a global supply chain contagion.
A domino effect.
I want to unpack this because if you reroute the ships, you spike the freight rates. If you spike the freight rates and the energy costs simultaneously, you inject a massive, uncontrolled dose of inflation directly into the veins of the global economy. Explain how this domino effect breaks the system.
We're looking at the very real probability of plunging Europe and Asia into a severe, intractable inflationary crisis. It is highly reminiscent of the energy shock of 2022 following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine.
Worse.
Economists are warning it could be far more acute given the sheer concentration of global energy resources in the Gulf. If this closure of Hormuz lasts for weeks, let alone months, the world faces a cascading macroeconomic crisis.
Break down the mechanics of that sovereign debt crisis the forecasters are terrified of. How does a blocked strait in the Middle East cause a country in South America or Africa to default?
It's a brutal chain reaction. High energy prices immediately drive up inflation globally because energy is a foundational input for literally everything: manufacturing, transport, agriculture.
It all needs oil.
When inflation spikes, central banks, like the U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, are forced to keep interest rates high to cool the economy down. However, many developing nations hold massive amounts of debt denominated in U.S. dollars.
Ah, I see.
When U.S. interest rates are high, the dollar strengthens, making their debt infinitely more expensive to service in their local currencies. Add to that the slowing economic growth due to the supply chain bottlenecks, and these nations simply cannot generate the revenue to pay their debts.
So they default.
It creates the perfect storm for a sovereign debt and currency crisis. Developing markets face defaults, currency collapses, and massive capital flight.
It's the ultimate domino effect. The war disrupts the oil spikes the inflation forces the high interest rates break the heavily indebted economies. And ultimately, the average consumer listening to this right now is the one who pays for it. At the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in their utility bills. There was an incredibly blunt quote from a financial analyst in one of the briefings who basically said, "We don't need these wars. We already have a homegrown debt problem, and funding a new massive war while simultaneously suffering from the inflation it causes is a recipe for absolute financial disaster."
The economic consequences are completely untethered from the geography of the war. They touch everyone, and this intense economic pressure immediately translates into profound diplomatic strain, which is exactly what we are seeing tear the Western alliance apart right now.
Exactly. Let's look at the diplomatic fallout. Because if I'm a European leader looking at a 131% spike in the gas my citizens need to survive, I am terrified.
They are panicking.
We have the United States, under President Donald Trump, pursuing an incredibly aggressive, rapid military campaign. And then we have Europe, staring down the barrel of an economic depression caused by that campaign. The diplomatic friction has been immediate and severe, and it centers largely around the logistics of actually fighting this war. Specifically, the issue of base access.
Launching an operation of the sheer magnitude of epic fury requires an immense global logistical footprint. The U.S. military, while powerful, relies heavily on its vast network of allied military bases globally to project power, refuel aircraft, and stage munitions.
Right.
But when the stakes are this high and the economic blowback is this undeniably severe, those allies suddenly begin to rigorously calculate their own national interest versus alliance loyalty.
And we saw that friction immediately out of the gate. The briefings detailed a very public, very bitter frustration from President Trump directed at the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
A huge clash.
Apparently, the UK significantly delayed granting the US access to British bases. Specifically, the highly strategic staging base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. They delayed it for a reported 48 hours.
They wanted legal review.
Right. The U.S. wanted to use it to launch heavy bombers, and the U.K. hesitated, insisting on legal reviews to ensure the actions were strictly defensive under international law before allowing bombers to take off. Trump publicly compared Starmer unfavorably to Winston Churchill, expressing sheer, televised disbelief that the U.K., America's closest ally, would hesitate for even a minute.
That hesitation from London, while deeply frustrating to Washington, is indicative of a much broader unease spreading across Europe. The UK ultimately relented, but the situation with Spain escalated into a full-blown historic diplomatic rupture.
Tell me about Spain.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez outright refused the U.S. permission to use Spanish military bases, specifically the naval station at Rota and the air base at Meron, for any offensive operations against Iran.
Outright refused.
He prioritized Spanish neutrality and domestic opposition to the war over the requests of Washington.
And President Trump's response was not what you would call diplomatic. It was essentially economic warfare deployed against a NATO ally.
The response was unprecedented in modern NATO history. Trump immediately announced the cessation of all U.S. trade with Spain.
Cut off completely.
He publicly lambasted the Spanish leadership and used the refusal to completely upend the NATO funding debate. He demanded that all NATO allies increase their defense spending not to the current, already contentious 2% target, but to a staggering 5% of their GDP.
5%.
He essentially told them that the U.S. would fly in and use the European bases anyway if they truly needed them, completely disregarding the sovereign rights of the host nations. It is a highly transactional, intensely coercive approach to alliance management that leaves Europe reeling.
You're either all in or you're out in the cold. That was the exact phrase used by a British politician analyzing the U.S. stance in one of the clips.
It perfectly sums it up.
But you can completely see why Europe is terrified. It's not just the energy inflation breaking their industries, though that's bad enough. It's the fear of a massive, uncontainable humanitarian catastrophe right on their doorstep. Let's remember, Iran is a massive nation of over 90 million people.
The demographic reality is what keeps European policymakers awake at night. If the Iranian state apparatus entirely collapses, or if the country is plunged into a protracted, devastating multi-year war of attrition, which seems increasingly likely given the IRGC's resilience.
The resulting displacement of civilians would be astronomical.
Astronomical. Europe is still deeply grappling with the political, economic, and social consequences of the Syrian and North African refugee crises of the past decade, which involved a fraction of the numbers we are talking about here.
A migration crisis involving millions of Iranians trying to reach Europe through Turkey and the Balkans would be a geopolitical nightmare for Brussels.
It would place an unimaginable, likely breaking strain on European social systems.
Yeah.
And politically, analysts universally agree it would fuel a massive, potentially unstoppable surge in far-right, anti-immigration political movements across the entire continent, fundamentally altering the political landscape of the European Union. Europe simply cannot absorb the fallout of a collapsed Iran.
Which perfectly explains the totally fractured European response we are seeing. You have nations like Spain outright refusing to participate and taking the economic hit from the US. You have the UK trying to walk this impossible tightrope.
Right, allowing defensive use of bases to appease the U.S., but trying to distance themselves from the offensive decapitation strikes to avoid domestic backlash.
And then you have figures like Germany's Friedrich Merz, who appears to align much closer to the U.S. position, advocating for a stronger, more militarized European posture, and seemingly willing to absorb the devastating economic hits to support the operation. The alliance isn't just strained, it's completely split.
It highlights a stark and profoundly uncomfortable reality for Europe that has been brewing for decades. They remain largely fundamentally dependent on the United States for their security architecture, yet they are structurally the most vulnerable to the economic and humanitarian fallout of American military adventures in the Middle East.
They pay the price for U.S. decisions.
European consumers and industries will bear the overwhelming brunt of the energy inflation caused by a war over which their leaders exercise absolutely no control.
While Europe is fracturing over the economic blowback, the other side of the geopolitical chessboard is solidifying. I was watching these YouTube analyses on the Eastern response, and we need to pivot to the strategic calculus of Russia and China, because they are absolutely not sitting this out.
No, they are deeply involved.
Both Moscow and Beijing immediately and fiercely condemned the U.S.-Israeli attacks at the UN Security Council. China called the strikes brazen, and Russia labeled it an unprovoked act of armed aggression. But it's way more than just strong words and vetoes at the UN.
The diplomatic condemnation at the UN is merely the superficial surface layer. The deeper reality, as painstakingly detailed in several of the geopolitical briefings we reviewed, is the profound structural military and technological integration that has occurred between Iran, Russia, and China over the past few years.
Right.
Following the regional escalations in 2024 and 2025, Moscow and Beijing fundamentally transitioned from being mere diplomatic supporters or trade partners to acting as the absolute technological anchors of Iranian strategic depth.
They gave them the good stuff.
They are the primary underlying reason Iran's military is capable of the sophisticated resistance it is currently displaying.
Let's get highly specific about these technological anchors, because the list of assets provided to Iran reads like a shopping list of advanced peer-to-peer warfare. First, from Russia, you have the Kayam spy satellite. Explain the impact of that.
The Kayam satellite, launched by Russia for Iran a few years prior, is a game-changer. It provides Tehran with high-resolution, continuous orbital reconnaissance. It essentially functions as Iran's unblinking eyes in the sky. It allows them to precisely monitor U.S. and Israeli-based movements, track naval deployments in the Gulf, and target their ballistic missile strikes with a degree of precision they simply lacked in previous decades.
Yeah.
They aren't shooting blind. They have Russian-provided orbital telemetry.
Then there's the aviation and electronic warfare side. Russia began delivering advanced Su-35 fighter jets, a massive order worth roughly $6.5 billion.
Huge investment.
And the analysts were very keen to point out that these aren't just standard export jets. They are equipped with highly specific electronic warfare pods and radars, specifically the Kibini-M and Irbis-E systems. Break down why those specific systems matter against the U.S.
The Su-35 itself is a highly capable air superiority fighter, but the electronic warfare suites are the real threat. The Kibini-M pod is a sophisticated jamming system designed specifically to disrupt the targeting radars of enemy aircraft and missiles. The Irbis-E radar is incredibly powerful and is designed to detect low observable stealth aircraft like the American F-35s at significant ranges. The F-35 relies heavily on its stealth, its ability to remain invisible to radar, to survive and strike.
So if they can see it, they can hit it.
If the Russians have given Iran the technology to effectively blind or detect the F-35s, they have fundamentally neutralized the United States' primary multi-billion-dollar aerial advantage.
It levels the playing field in a way the West hasn't faced in the Middle East before. And it's not just the jets. Multiple intelligence reports in the sources confirm the delivery of Russian S-400 air defense systems and the Resonan's NE over-the-horizon radar.
Exactly. This creates a layered, highly sophisticated, integrated air defense network. The Resonan's radar can track stealth targets and ballistic missiles at incredibly long ranges, feeding that data to the S-400 batteries.
Cool.
And crucially, from China, Iran has fully integrated the Beidou-3 navigation satellite system into their military hardware.
Which means they don't need GPS.
Precisely. It makes their missile guidance systems entirely independent of the Western-controlled GPS network. This is absolutely critical because the very first thing the U.S. does in a conflict is jam or degrade GPS signals in the region to blind enemy munitions.
But with Beidou, they don't care.
With Beidou, Iran's missiles keep flying straight to their targets, guided by Chinese satellites.
Okay, so Russia and China have heavily armed Iran with top-tier, peer-level tech. The obvious, glaring question is, why? Are they just doing this out of the goodness of their hearts or simply out of anti-Western spite?
It is entirely strategic and driven by profound, calculated self-interest. It is about protecting the physical and economic infrastructure of the emerging multipolar world order. Russia and China rely heavily on massive strategic trade routes that are specifically designed to bypass Western maritime control and U.S. Navy choke points.
Like,
China has the trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, aiming to link Asia to Europe overland. Russia is deeply invested in the international north-south transport corridor, which runs right through Iran, specifically utilizing Iranian rail networks and ports like Bandar Abbas.
which notably was one of the very first targets of the U.S. strikes.
Exactly.
So Iran is the geographic bridge for both of these superpowers.
Precisely. If Iran's infrastructure collapses, or if a pro-Western government is installed, those vital non-Western trade routes collapse with it. Iran is the geographic linchpin of Eurasian economic integration. By attacking Iran, the U.S. and Israel are not just fighting a regional foe, they are directly, physically threatening the core long-term economic strategies of both Russia and China.
Which brings us to a genuinely terrifying credibility test for Moscow and Beijing. The experts in these briefings raise a critical existential question. If this intense bombardment continues and Iran faces total infrastructural collapse and regime destruction, what do Russia and China actually do?
They are rapidly approaching what geopolitical analysts refer to as a credibility floor. To maintain their status as the leaders of a multipolar alternative to the West, they cannot simply sit back and watch their primary, most heavily invested regional partner be systematically dismantled by Washington.
Right.
If they fail to move beyond providing technology and angry UN speeches, if they don't step into active military deterrence and draw a hard red line, they risk a massive, irreversible credibility deficit across the entire global South. Every country watching this will conclude that the Russo-Chinese security umbrella is completely worthless when the pressure is truly on.
So the horrific question is, do they intervene more directly, perhaps with their own naval assets or explicit nuclear umbrellas, to save face and protect their investments, or do they step back to avoid triggering an outright World War III?
That is the razor's edge the world is walking right now.
And it leads us perfectly into looking ahead, what actually happens in the coming weeks. Because right now, there is a massive domestic information war happening alongside the actual kinetic war. You have two completely contrasting, irreconcilable narratives being broadcast.
The cognitive dissonance is striking. On one side, you have the official narrative coming relentlessly from U.S. leadership.
Yeah.
President Trump has repeatedly stated in press briefings that the military operation is way ahead of schedule.
Right.
The official claim is that the Iranian Air Force is a memory, their radar systems are wiped out, and their mobile launchers have been incinerated in the mountains. The projection, pushed by this camp, is that the conflict is essentially a mopping-up operation and could be wrapped up in a matter of a few short weeks. It is a narrative of overwhelming, clinical, rapid victory.
But then you contrast that with the reality on the ground, the very reality we've just spent the last hour discussing based on the analyst briefings, the daily, continuous, unbroken barrages of Iranian ballistic and cruise missiles raining down.
It hasn't stopped.
Not at all. The fact that the Pentagon is openly admitting in leaks that they are burning through irreplaceable interceptor stockpiles at an entirely unsustainable rate. The sheer mathematics of the interceptor war, the $10 million missile hitting the $20,000 drone, suggests this is absolutely not wrapping up neatly. Iran is highly prepared for and actively executing a grueling multi-year war of attrition.
And that profound disconnect between the political narrative of a swift victory and the military reality of a protracted war of attrition is where the risk of extreme vertical escalation lies.
Yeah.
If the air campaign fundamentally fails to stop the Iranian missile launches, if those subterranean mountain bases simply hold out and keep firing, what is the next logical step for the U.S. to do? President Trump has explicitly, publicly not ruled out putting boots on the ground in Iran if deemed necessary to secure the objectives.
That's a massive escalation.
The briefings even mention active efforts by the CIA to arm Kurdish separatist forces to spark internal uprisings, strongly hinting at a strategy that involves ground elements and regime change.
An invasion of Iran. Iran is a massive, mountainous country of over 90 million people. It makes Iraq look like a minor skirmish. It would be a logistical and military undertaking of staggering generational proportions. And what's the political runway for that back home? Because the public opinion data featured in these sources is really telling. It shows massive, significant disapproval right from the start.
Really low support.
Polls indicate that over 43% of Americans already disapprove of the war, compared to only 27% approving. In Europe, the opposition is even fiercer. If gas prices stay up 131% and the global economy starts to genuinely buckle, how long can Western leaders sustain a massive war effort that their own populations actively reject and can no longer afford?
The political clock is ticking just as fast, if not faster, than the military one. The pressure to end this quickly is immense. But perhaps the most terrifying prospect raised by the military analysts concerns the intersection of those depleted Western defenses and Iran's withheld advanced weaponry.
Okay, tell me about that.
We discussed the massive burn rate of U.S. and Israeli SM-3 and SAID interceptors. The critical question is, what happens if, 3 or 4 weeks from now, those magazines on the destroyers are essentially empty and production lines can't keep up?
Right. They run out of the golden fly swatter?
Exactly. The intelligence sources strongly indicate that Iran has deliberately held back its most advanced, most destructive weapons from these initial swarms. Specifically, their next-generation hypersonic glide vehicles, like the Fatah 2.
Hypersonics.
These are weapons designed to maneuver unpredictably at unimaginable speeds, Mach 10 or higher, skipping along the edge of the atmosphere, specifically to evade the very interceptors that the U.S. is currently exhausting on cheap drones.
So they drain the shield, and then they throw the spear.
Precisely. If the defensive shield of the U.S. and Israel is mathematically depleted, and Iran unleashes a wave of unstoppable hypersonics against critical, irreplaceable infrastructure in Israel or major U.S. bases in the Gulf, the devastation would be catastrophic. And the pressure on the U.S. to retaliate and escalate to unthinkable levels, perhaps even utilizing non-conventional nuclear weapons to stop the onslaught, would be immense.
It is a truly sobering, terrifying thought. And as we reach the end of this deep dive, let's take a moment to synthesize the sheer scale of the ground we've covered today. We are witnessing a geopolitical earthquake that is reshaping the world in real time. It started with an unprecedented decapitation strike that fundamentally altered the leadership structure of Iran, wiping out the supreme leader and top generals, yet failing to shatter the decentralized IRGC.
They survived the initial blow.
And it instantly morphed into a massive, regional, asymmetric missile war, drawing in sovereign nations from Cyprus to the UAE and activating proxy militias across the entire Middle East. It has completely frozen the Strait of Hormuz, arguably the most vital shipping choke point on Earth, triggering a massive immediate energy shock and threatening a global inflationary and sovereign debt crisis.
The economic fallout is just beginning.
And politically, it has profoundly fractured the Western alliance, while forcing the Eastern powers of Russia and China to decide exactly how far they will go to protect their multipolar vision and economic trade routes.
The complexity, the sheer scale, and the blinding speed of this crisis are its defining features. We are in uncharted territory. Every single tactical military decision made in the Gulf right now has an immediate, profound, and often unintended global consequence.
And that is exactly why I want to remind you, the listener, why this matters so deeply to you. The effects of this conflict are absolutely not going to stay confined to the deserts or the mountains of the Middle East. You are going to feel this.
You'll feel it everywhere.
You're going to feel it intimately when you fill up your gas tank to get to work. You are going to feel it in the explosive price of groceries as global freight costs skyrocket. You will feel it in the cost of a mortgage or borrowing money if central banks raise interest rates to combat the war-driven inflation. The political stability of nations worldwide, including your own, will be severely tested by the economic shockwaves generated by this conflict.
Which leaves us with a final, and perhaps the most provocative question to ponder as we watch these historic events unfold in the coming weeks. The stated ultimate goal of Operation Epic Fury, particularly from the U.S. and Israeli perspective, was to secure Western interests, permanently eliminate a regional threat, and stabilize the Middle East on Western terms.
That was the plan.
But what if the profound economic shockwaves of this war, the staggering energy crises, the broken global supply chains, the weaponization of vital trade routes, instead rapidly accelerate the world's permanent division?
What do you mean?
What if this immense pressure forces the entire global south, backed heavily by Russia and China, to rapidly build entirely separate financial systems, alternative energy trading networks, and independent supply chains to permanently insulate themselves from Western military dominance and economic coercion? Could it be that a tactical military victory in the Middle East, inadvertently but inevitably, result in a permanent strategic defeat for the current Western-led global order?
A terrifying, fascinating, and deeply important thought to leave you with. The world is being fundamentally rewired in real time before our eyes. Stay informed, stay critical of the narratives, and we will be here to help you unpack whatever comes next.
A new war has just exploded in the Middle East, and in a matter of days, the entire world has been pushed to the brink. We're going to break down what's happening right now, hour by hour, in this rapidly escalating crisis.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this, we're not actually going to start at the beginning of the fighting. We're going to start with the immediate shockwave that rippled across the globe. You see, before we could even begin to count the human cost, the entire global economic system was already flashing bright red alerts.
Because let's be clear, this is not just another regional conflict. This is a global crisis, full stop. From the very moment the first strikes landed, a world that was already on pretty fragile footing got shoved right to the edge of a cliff.
And look, we are not talking about hypotheticals or things that might happen. The economic fallout was instantaneous. We saw energy prices just surge. Markets around the world plunged, and that hits your pensions, your savings, and at the same time, thousands of flights were grounded and critical shipping lanes were just shut down. All of this brought back that very real fear of a brand new global recession.
You know, this sentiment from market analysts really sums up the absolute shock of it all. The speed of this escalation, going from what was a very tense peace to all-out war, it caught nearly everyone completely flat-footed. It really highlights a catastrophic failure to read just how incredibly volatile the situation had become.
So the big question is, how did we get here so unbelievably fast? Let's walk through the timeline of the first 5 days. This is a period of just rapid, devastating escalation.
What's absolutely striking here is the domino effect. It all kicked off on February 28th with a joint U.S.-Israeli Operation Epic Fury, which resulted in the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. While Iran's retaliation was swift and it was widespread. Then, things got even worse. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Hezbollah jumped into the fight from Lebanon. And then finally, the conflict spilled into Europe, with missiles hitting Cyprus. Every single action triggered a bigger, more dangerous reaction, just pulling the entire region into the fire within hours. And as you can imagine, as those dominoes fell, the conflict just kept expanding. This is no longer a two-sided fight. It has exploded into a full-blown regional firestorm, pulling in this incredibly complex web of alliances and enemies.
So on one side, you've got this coordinated military campaign by the United States and Israel. And on the other, you have Iran and its whole network of allied militant groups spread across the region. You're talking Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq. They're collectively known as the Axis of Resistance.
And this slide, wow, it just shows you perfectly how this thing is spilling over everywhere. It is not just the main players anymore. You have the Gulf monarchies scrambling their defenses against missile strikes. Jordan is intercepting projectiles. There's an Israeli ground incursion starting in Lebanon. And missiles are hitting Cyprus. The battlefield is literally expanding by the day.
So here's the really crucial thing to understand about this whole situation. We are witnessing 3 distinct but deeply interconnected crises all hitting at the same time. An economic one, a geopolitical one, and a humanitarian one.
Economically, it all starts right here. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, which is the world's single most critical oil artery, it was a deliberate move. They weaponized the global energy supply, instantly choking off a huge percentage of the world's oil.
And the market's reaction? You could almost see it coming, but that didn't make it any less brutal. Oil prices just shot up to alarming new highs, while major stock indexes in the US and Europe just plunged. We're talking trillions in value wiped out, shaking financial confidence across the entire world. And then on the world stage, politically, this conflict is forcing a massive reshuffle. Russia immediately condemned what it called unprovoked aggression. China is calling for a ceasefire, and both of them are pushing for an emergency UN session, very strategically positioning themselves as a counterweight to the West, and directly challenging decades of American dominance in the region.
And then, of course, there is the devastating human cost. And remember, these are just the early numbers from the first 5 days. They already show thousands killed or injured across multiple countries, with the vast majority being ordinary civilians just caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, and beyond the casualties, we are seeing a massive new humanitarian disaster unfold. In Lebanon alone, the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah has already forced over 30,000 people from their homes. Families just fleeing, with no idea what their future holds.
So all of this leads to the most important question of all. What comes next? With this conflict still raging, the world is at a major turning point. And right now, it looks like there are two very, very different paths forward emerging from all this chaos. On one hand, this could just drag on forever, a long, grinding war of attrition that completely exhausts everyone and risks a global financial crisis that could be even worse than 2008. But on the other hand, some believe this violence could be the very thing that forces a global reset, a painful recalibration of power that finally ends undisputed American dominance and forges a new multipolar order for the Middle East.
Ultimately, this conflict is about so much more than just Iran or Israel. It's really a violent symptom of a global power structure that's been cracking for years. The outcome here won't just reshape the Middle East, it's going to define the new world that's being built right now in its place.
You've seen the headlines, the alert banners that have just been flashing across your screen since last weekend.
Right, it's been nonstop.
Exactly, Operation Epic Fury. And we're not here today to give you the standard news bulletin or, frankly, the breathless cable news punditry that you've been totally bombarded with over the last few days.
Yeah, you already know the world you woke up to this morning is fundamentally different from the one that existed at the end of February.
Right. Our mission today is entirely different. We are bypassing all that noise, and we're going straight into the raw data.
And it is a massive stack of data we're looking at today.
It really is. I mean, we're talking incredibly dense sources. We've got real-time maritime and signal intelligence data, internal geopolitical strategy papers, global economic forecasts from the major institutional banks, and these really granular international security timelines.
Which is what you need to actually understand this.
Yeah, right. Because we are here to look at the architectural reality of what just happened in the Middle East. The actual military and technological mechanics on the ground, and exactly how these cascading events are going to reshape the global economy and, frankly, your daily life in the coming weeks.
Yeah, we're looking at the ripple effects.
Exactly. No spin, no taking sides, just the objective facts and a deep analysis of this geopolitical earthquake. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
We need to start by understanding the spark, because while the February 28th strikes felt, incredibly sudden to the public, the intelligence papers show this absolutely did not happen in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
To understand why the status quo ended so violently, we have to look at the specific precursors, starting with the collapse of the diplomatic framework last year.
Right. To really understand the why behind the sheer scale of Operation Epic Fury, the strategy papers dictate that we have to rewind to the summer of 2025.
Right, the 12-day war.
Exactly. The event analysts officially refer to as the 12-day war in June of that year. That was it was a brief but incredibly intense exchange of kinetic strikes between Israel and Iran.
And it was contained, right, relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking, yes. But the secondary effect, the diplomatic fallout, was absolute. That 12-day window effectively annihilated the 2025 nuclear negotiations that were happening in Geneva.
And the sources indicate that once those talks collapsed, the diplomatic off-ramp just vanished.
It was gone.
But what did that actually look like on the ground? Because the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, they started publishing reports shortly after that were sounding a massive alarm. What exactly were they seeing in those inspections?
The IAEA findings were stark. I mean, highly specific and stark. They weren't just observing a gradual increase in activity. They documented that Iran's uranium enrichment was rapidly approaching weapons-grade levels.
Wow.
Yeah, pushing past the 60% threshold and moving aggressively toward that critical 90% mark.
But it wasn't just the percentage, right? The volume was the real issue.
Exactly. More concerning to international observers was the sheer volume. The IAEA documented an unprecedented stockpile of highly enriched uranium. And the strategic papers in our stack emphasized that this stockpile lacked any credible, justifiable civilian purpose.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, this intelligence indicated that Tehran had achieved the capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple nuclear devices on incredibly short notice.
What they call the breakout time.
Right, the breakout time. We were no longer talking about months to build a device. We were looking at a window of weeks or, terrifyingly, potentially days.
Okay, so you have this nuclear clock ticking louder and louder on the international stage, obviously alarming the U.S. and Israel. But simultaneously, the domestic intelligence reports from inside Iran paint a picture of a country that was essentially a powder keg, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The data from late 2025 and early 2026 shows a regime facing an existential crisis from within its own borders.
Yeah, and history consistently shows us that when a ruling apparatus feels cornered domestically, the overall geopolitical volatility just skyrockets.
Right.
And the economic forecasts from that period show the Iranian economy in an absolute tailspin. The rial, the national currency, was experiencing catastrophic devaluation.
I mean, we're talking hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class virtually overnight.
Precisely. And as a direct result, you had massive, sustained public protests paralyzing major cities.
We are looking at reports of millions of people in the streets, a complete fracturing of the social contract.
Exactly. So you have a leadership structure facing an acute, immediate threat to its survival from its own population, while simultaneously pushing its nuclear program to the absolute edge.
But just draws the crosshairs of the United States and Israel directly onto them.
Yes. That intersection of internal desperation and external provocation is the precarious foundation upon which Operation Epic Fury was built. The strategic calculus in Washington and Tel Aviv shifted abruptly from containment to preemptive neutralization.
Which brings us to the events of February 28th, 2026. And the data describing this assault, it's truly difficult to process the sheer scale of it.
It rewrites the playbook.
It really does. The military briefings describe a synchronized, multi-wave assault that fundamentally rewrites modern engagement doctrines. We are looking at the deployment of U.S. B-2 stealth bombers flying massive intercontinental sorties to drop 2,000-pound bunker-busting munitions on hardened, deeply subterranean ballistic missile facilities.
That's just the start.
Right. We have reports of squadrons of F-35 fighter jets penetrating the airspace, backed by massive, overwhelming barrages of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval assets in the region. But the detail in these operational reports that really stands out is a targeting mechanism.
Yeah, this wasn't the old way of doing things.
No, these weren't just pre-programmed GPS coordinates. The munitions were guided by highly advanced AI-assisted targeting systems that were updating terminal trajectories in real time based on the shifting battlefield environment.
And that technological leap is paired with a massive strategic pivot. For the last 2 decades, Western military planning regarding Iran has primarily focused on surgical strikes.
Right, like hypotheticals.
Hypothetical scenarios designed to degrade specific nuclear infrastructure. Facilities like the enrichment plant at Natanz, the underground site at Fordo, or the research centers in Isfahan.
And Operation Epic Fury obviously targeted those sites with extreme prejudice.
It did. But the core directive of this campaign went much, much further. This was explicitly designed, from the very first wave of munitions, as a comprehensive decapitation strike.
Let's focus on that term, decapitation strike, because the target list reads like a complete erasure of the Iranian command structure. It wasn't just radar arrays and centrifuges.
No, the targeting was aimed directly at the absolute highest echelons of the state. The strikes successfully eliminated the supreme leader. And coordinated, simultaneous strikes on fortified compounds and command bunkers also killed the Minister of Defense, the overall commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces.
They removed the entire strategic and operational brain trust of the country's military and political apparatus in a matter of hours.
They did.
We have to pause here, though, and impartially look at the human costs detailed in these after-action reports, because the collateral damage of a campaign this massive is severe.
Yes, it is heavily documented.
The destruction extends far beyond military compounds. The civilian casualty metrics are mounting rapidly. The reports detail a horrific incident in the city of Minab, where a girls' elementary school was struck during a bombing run aimed at a nearby logistical hub.
A terrible tragedy.
The confirmed fatalities from that single strike are at 180, including 108 children. Additionally, the tracking data shows confirmed strikes occurring in incredibly close proximity to major civilian hospitals in the capital, Tehran.
Causing massive structural damage.
Right, cutting off power to life support systems and triggering widespread panic that has led to further casualties. The sheer kinetic force being applied to these urban centers is devastating.
What's fascinating here is how the source material categorizes the methodology of this destruction. The tactical papers don't just describe a traditional air campaign. They describe the absolute apex of multi-domain warfare.
Meaning the physical bombs were just one part of it.
Exactly. The kinetic strikes, the bombs and missiles were only one layer of the assault. For instance, the physical destruction of the Tehran Revolutionary Court, which is a massive symbol of the regime's domestic power, was executed at the exact same moment that Allied cyber commands unleashed what analysts are definitively calling the largest, most sophisticated cyber attack in recorded history.
And what does that cyber component actually look like on the ground? Because you hear cyber attack and you usually think of stolen passwords or a website going down, but the intelligence paints a picture of total infrastructural paralysis.
We are talking about the complete weaponization of the digital grid. The cyber warfare component actively targeted the industrial control systems of the Iranian power grid, literally plunging massive sections of the country, including the capital, into total darkness.
Blinding them.
Right. It severed internal military communication networks, blinding the secondary command structures that managed to survive the initial bombings. But perhaps the most psychological aspect of this multi-domain approach was the digital hijacking.
The prayer apps.
Yes.
I read that and couldn't believe it.
The reports confirm that highly popular civilian prayer applications, which are installed on millions of smartphones across the country, were infiltrated. Instead of their standard functions, these apps were hijacked to push out coordinated mass broadcast messages.
Urging the surviving military units to stand down.
Yes, and urging the general public to actively defect and overthrow the remnants of the local government. When you combine the heavy kinetic bombardment, the systemic leadership decapitation, the blinding of the power grid, and this unprecedented psychological digital warfare, the strategy becomes incredibly clear.
This was never about mere deterrence.
Never. This was a calculated operation designed to precipitate total, irreversible regime collapse.
So you have a shattered status quo. The top tier of leadership is gone, the subterranean infrastructure is burning, and the entire digital and electrical grid is severely compromised. Which brings us to the immediate aftermath and the regional response.
The response was immediate.
Right. For years, geopolitical analysts, and indeed many of the strategy papers we've read in the past, have talked about Iran's overriding doctrine of strategic patience.
Yes, the long game.
The idea was that Tehran would absorb kinetic blows, play the long geopolitical game, and utilize its vast network of proxy militias rather than engaging in direct state-on-state warfare. But the intelligence flowing in from the first days of March shows that the era of strategic patience is entirely over.
It evaporated the very second the Supreme Leader and the IRGC command were decapitated. The operational doctrine shifted instantaneously. What we observed in the immediate hours following the U.S. and Israeli strikes was the activation of a massive counteroffensive.
Led by who is left.
Exactly. The surviving elements of the IRGC command structure dubbed this the 11th wave of Operation True Promise. And this was not a measured proportional response. This was a pivot to total, unconstrained, maximum yield retaliation.
The radar tracking data from this counteroffensive is just a wall of inbound threats. We are looking at massive, synchronized waves of medium and long-range ballistic missiles combined with swarms of loitering munitions, suicide drones.
But the critical shift here is the targeting.
Right. They didn't just fire back at Israel.
No, they explicitly expanded the map, targeting United States military interests, logistical hubs, and allied infrastructure across the entire Middle East. They effectively ignited a literal ring of fire across the Gulf.
The geographical breadth of the retaliation is staggering, and it's clearly designed to overwhelm the integrated air defense systems of the entire region. The data shows incoming fire directed at U.S. installations and allied host nations across the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia.
It is a sudden, violently executed regional explosion.
Let's look at some of the specific incidents detailed in these real-time security timelines, because they highlight the absolute chaos that has descended on the region. We are talking about the definitive fog of war.
It's pure chaos in the airspace.
For example, the reports confirm that a ballistic missile successfully bypassed outer defense layers and directly struck the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. We have tracking data showing drones penetrating the airspace over Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and impacting the U.S. Embassy compound.
And crucially, the targeting doctrine of this 11th wave wasn't limited to military or diplomatic structures. We are seeing the deliberate targeting of foundational civilian and economic infrastructure. One of the most stark data points in our stack is the drone strike that hit an Amazon Web Services data center in the United Arab Emirates.
Let's just pause on that for a second. An AWS data center, that isn't a military base. That's the cloud architecture that runs banking, logistics, and civilian communications for the region.
Exactly. And the strike set the facility on fire, causing immediate localized digital outages and data routing failures. It demonstrates a clear intent to inflict maximum economic and logistical pain, recognizing that data infrastructure is as critical as physical supply lines.
But perhaps the most terrifying example of the chaos you mentioned, that fog of war, is the friendly fire incident detailed in the aviation logs.
The situation in Kuwait. In the frantic, highly saturated environment of trying to track and intercept dozens of incoming Iranian ballistic missiles and drones, the airspace became completely chaotic. The logs show that Kuwaiti air defense systems, operating on high alert, mistakenly locked onto friendly radar signatures.
Oh, man.
They engaged and successfully shot down 3 United States F-15 fighter jets.
That incident alone underscores how overwhelmed the regional defense architecture became in the opening hours of this exchange. The skies are so saturated with munitions that friend or foe identification systems are failing under the pressure.
It's a nightmare scenario for air defense operators.
And as if the Persian Gulf wasn't volatile enough, the intelligence timelines show entirely new fronts opening up simultaneously. The conflict is immediately spilling over its borders. In the Levant, Hezbollah has officially abandoned its border skirmishes and declared all-out war on Israel, launching incredibly heavy, sustained rocket barrages toward major northern population centers like the city of Haifa.
Which triggered a direct response.
Right. In direct response, the Israeli military has initiated a massive ground invasion into southern Lebanon, pushing armor and infantry across the Blue Line to root out the launch sites. But there's also a deeply complex, rapidly evolving internal dynamic unfolding inside Iran itself, isn't there? The decapitation strike seems to have acted as a catalyst.
It absolutely has. The intelligence assessments from the ground point to a rapidly escalating internal front that could fundamentally alter the map of the country. In the western mountainous regions, various armed Kurdish opposition groups, which have historically been deeply fragmented by ideological and tribal differences, are now putting those differences aside.
They're banding together.
Yes, they are uniting into a cohesive militant front to fight the weakened, disorganized remnants of the central regime's security forces. And the most critical detail in these intelligence reports is the external involvement.
Right, the foreign intel.
There are multiple, highly credible reports indicating that foreign intelligence agencies are already on the ground, actively working to arm, supply, and coordinate these Kurdish groups. The strategic goal of these foreign actors is to use the chaos of the airstrikes and the power vacuum in Tehran to spark a much broader, nationwide armed uprising against whatever is left of the central government.
Which makes me think about the Gulf nations. The host countries caught in the middle of this. We are talking about countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. These nations host massive U.S. military bases, which makes them targets.
Yeah.
But they have also spent the last decade and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to diversify their economies away from a pure reliance on crude oil exports. They're building these Vision 2030 initiatives, creating trillion-dollar domestic economies based on high-end tourism, global finance, artificial intelligence, and global logistics.
They want to be the future.
Exactly. So how does a nation navigate being caught directly in the crossfire of a ballistic missile war when their entire economic future relies on projecting an image of hypermodern stability?
It is the absolute realization of their worst-case scenario. For years, these nations have engaged in a desperate, highly delicate diplomatic balancing act. They have maintained deep, structural security ties with Washington, hosting the air bases and naval fleets, while simultaneously attempting to normalize diplomatic and economic relations with Tehran to ensure the regional stability their investments require.
They're trying to be the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Right, while hosting the primary strike assets of one of the combatants. Now, with ballistic missiles falling on their data centers and their airspace turned into an active lethal war zone, that balancing act has catastrophically failed.
They're being forced to choose.
They're being forced to activate their Patriot and Patriot missile batteries to intercept Iranian munitions, effectively making them active participants in the war while simultaneously trying to signal to global investors that their financial centers are safe. It is an impossible contradiction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because if you just look at a map, this looks like a devastating Middle Eastern regional war. But the geopolitical strategy papers in our source stack heavily emphasize the shadow involvement of two major global players, Russia and China.
The real power brokers here.
Reading through these assessments, it becomes clear that this conflict is essentially a massive, high-stakes proxy stress test for the entire global order.
To understand the true geopolitical chessboard, we have to look closely at how Moscow and Beijing have positioned themselves over the last year. Following that June 2025 conflict, Russia and China fundamentally transitioned their relationship with Iran.
Right, they didn't just sign a treaty.
No, they realized that forming a direct, mutual defense military alliance with Tehran might be too provocative and could trigger a preemptive Western response before they were ready. So instead, they adopted a different strategy. They became what intelligence analysts term technological anchors.
Technological anchors.
Yes. They flooded the Iranian military apparatus with highly advanced, asymmetric military technology designed specifically to blunt or counter traditional Western air and naval advantages.
And the sources give us incredibly concrete, specific examples of this technology transfer, which completely changes how we have to view the Iranian military capability today. We aren't just talking about shipping them crates of small arms or basic artillery.
No, this is top-tier tech.
From Russia, the intelligence shows Iran received squadrons of Su-35 Flanker-E fighter jets, but crucially, these weren't standard export models. They were equipped with specialized anti-stealth radar systems designed specifically to detect aircraft like the American F-35s.
A direct countermeasure.
Exactly. They also received advanced S-400 air defense batteries to protect their nuclear sites. But the space domain is where it gets wild. The intelligence confirms Russia gave Iranian commanders access to the Kayam spy satellite.
The Kayam satellite transfer is a massive force multiplier. The data shows this satellite provides 1.2-meter high-resolution imagery.
Walk us through why that specific resolution matters. What does 1.2-meter resolution actually let an Iranian commander see from space?
It shifts their capability from general awareness to precision targeting. At 1.2 meters, you aren't just seeing that a U.S. base exists. You are tracking the exact movement of individual supply trucks. You are seeing which specific aircraft hangars are occupied, and you are monitoring the deployment patterns of Patriot missile batteries in real time.
So they can see the defenses shifting.
Exactly. It allowed the IRGC to map the precise coordinates of U.S. and Israeli infrastructure across the region, which directly enabled the accuracy of the 11th wave retaliation we just discussed. They weren't firing blind. They had a God's eye view provided by Moscow.
And from China, the technological transfers were equally devastating, particularly in the maritime and signal domains. The documents show Iran was fully integrated into the Beidou 3 navigation system.
The Beidou 3 integration cannot be overstated. Western military strategy has long relied on electronic warfare. You know, the ability to jam GPS signals, blinding the enemy's missiles and cutting off their communication.
But Beidou 3 is different.
It's the Chinese alternative to GPS, and it utilizes advanced frequency hopping and highly encrypted military bands. By integrating Iran into this network, Beijing essentially gave the Iranian military a secure, unjammable central nervous system.
That's huge.
It allows their drones and anti-ship missiles to navigate to their targets even when U.S. electronic warfare planes are flooding the zone with interference.
And speaking of anti-ship missiles, the Chinese also supplied Tehran with the CM-302 supersonic cruise missiles.
Yes, the CM-302s. In naval circles, these are explicitly known as carrier killers.
Carrier killers.
They fly at supersonic speeds, skimming just above the surface of the water to evade radar detection until the very last seconds. When you combine jam-resistant navigation from the Beidou 3 network with supersonic sea-skimming anti-ship missiles, you fundamentally alter the maritime security dynamic in the Persian Gulf. You create a no-go zone for traditional carrier strike groups.
But the obvious question is why? Why are Russia and China investing so heavily and risking so much technological capital to ensure Iran's survival? What are the actual global stakes for Moscow and Beijing if the Iranian regime completely collapses under the weight of Operation Epic Fury?
It all comes down to geography, energy flows, and the grand strategic push for a multipolar world order that actively excludes the United States. For China, Iran is the vital, non-negotiable geographical linchpin for their Belt and Road Initiative.
The BRI.
Right. The BRI requires a secure land-based route that allows Chinese energy imports from the Middle East to flow back to the mainland without having to pass through the Strait of Malacca.
Why is the Strait of Malacca an issue for them?
Because it's a narrow maritime choke point near Singapore that is heavily monitored and essentially controlled by the U.S. Navy and its allies. If a war breaks out over Taiwan, for example, the U.S. could choke off China's energy supply at Malacca. Iran provides the overland bypass.
And for Russia, the reliance is just as deep, but focused on a different trade route.
Exactly. For Russia, Iran is the absolute centerpiece of the International North-South Transport Corridor, or the INSTC. Over the last few years, heavy Western sanctions have effectively isolated Russia's traditional European-facing trade routes. The INSTC is their economic lifeline.
How does it work physically?
It allows Russian goods, oil, and agricultural products to flow down from the mainland through the Caspian Sea, directly across the Iranian landmass via rail and road, and out into the massive, lucrative markets of India and the broader global south.
So if Iran falls...
If a pro-Western government replaces the current regime in Tehran, or worse, if Iran descends into a fractured, failed state controlled by warring militias, those vital economic lifelines for both Moscow and Beijing are instantly severed. Their grand strategic alternative to the Western financial system falls apart without Iranian geography.
That explains the hardware.
Furthermore, the geopolitical strategy papers highlight an immense intangible perception risk here. There is a concept being heavily discussed in these intelligence briefings called the credibility deficit.
The credibility deficit.
Russia and China have spent years aggressively courting the global south. Countries in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, they have touted a new, multipolar alternative to Western dominance, promising security and technological partnerships without human rights strings attached.
But if they let their primary regional anchor fall...
Precisely. If Russia and China, having provided all of this advanced technology, simply stand by and watch the Iranian regime get dismantled by American and Israeli stealth bombers, they risk a massive, unrecoverable loss of credibility.
The rest of the world is watching.
The leaders of the global south are watching this conflict incredibly closely. If the Eurasian security umbrella fails its very first major existential stress test, the entire narrative of a reliable, multipolar world order collapses. Why would a developing nation align with Beijing or Moscow if their backing doesn't actually protect you when the American missiles start flying? They have to prove that their technological anchors actually hold in a Category 5 geopolitical hurricane.
Which brings us perfectly to how this massive geopolitical chess match is impacting the rest of the world, and specifically how it is about to impact you, the person listening to this right now. Because the theater of war has rapidly expanded beyond military bases and airspace. It has expanded directly into the central arteries of global trade. Let's talk about the ultimate economic choke point, the Strait of Hormuz.
In conjunction with the ballistic missile retaliation, the IRGC has officially declared that the Strait of Hormuz is closed to all traffic.
Completely shut down.
They have issued stark public statements threatening to set fire to any commercial or military ship that attempts to transit the waterway. And the maritime intelligence data we're looking at proves this isn't just standard political bluster. The reality on the water shifted overnight.
The numbers in the maritime tracking reports are staggering. Almost immediately following the IRGC declaration, there was a 61% drop in commercial crossings through the strait. You had massive container ships and oil tankers slamming on the brakes.
They just stopped.
Simultaneously, the global shipping trackers recorded a 112% surge in vessels abruptly altering their course, choosing to take the massive, weeks-long, highly expensive detour around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa rather than risk the Gulf. But there's another fascinating, slightly terrifying detail in the maritime intelligence regarding the Iranian fleet itself.
The digital fog.
Right. The visible crude oil exports from Iran have entirely vanished from global tracking systems. The data analysts are literally calling it a digital fog.
The digital fog is a highly orchestrated evasion tactic. The ships are still physically out there on the water, but they have systematically turned off their AI's transponders.
That's the automatic identification systems that broadcast their location, speed, and heading.
Correct. They are operating completely in the dark, creating massive dark fleets of heavily laden oil tankers moving silently through international waters, making it incredibly difficult for Western navies to track their movements or enforce any kind of embargo.
And the threat to civilian shipping isn't just theoretical or contained to the strait itself. The conflict has rapidly moved to target the vital, multi-billion-dollar economic hubs of the broader region. We have data showing that drones and ballistic missiles have actively struck the port of Jebel Ali in Dubai.
Which is massive.
For context, Jebel Ali isn't just a dock. It is one of the busiest, most technologically advanced, and most important logistical hubs on the planet. Striking it is like striking the central nervous system of global shipping. The port of Dukman in Oman, a vital node for energy transport outside the immediate Gulf, has also been hit. And we have confirmed tragic reports of commercial tankers being struck in open international water.
The incident involving the Skylight is a grim milestone.
Tell us about the Skylight.
The Skylight, a Palo-flagged commercial tanker, was struck directly by a loitering munition. The maritime reports confirmed significant structural damage, but more importantly, confirmed seafarer fatalities.
Innocent sailors.
When you have commercial sailors being killed on civilian cargo ships, the entire calculus of global maritime insurance and shipping logistics alters instantly. The risk to civilian shipping is no longer a possibility. It is a profound and immediate reality.
Let's crystallize this. What does this mean practically for your daily life? Because this isn't just a distant geopolitical event. The entire modern global supply chain relies entirely on one concept: predictability. It relies on just-in-time manufacturing, where components arrive exactly when needed to keep costs low.
And right now,
Because of this conflict, there is zero predictability in the system. We are watching the permanent death of just-in-time global manufacturing. Major global carriers, the foundational pillars of global trade like Maersk, CMA CGM, and FedEx, have completely halted bookings for the entire region, or they are rerouting their massive fleets thousands of miles out of the way.
and the financial penalties of those logistical nightmares are instantaneous. The economic forecasts show that emergency conflict surcharges have been enacted by the major shipping lines practically overnight.
How much are we talking about?
If you are a manufacturer trying to move goods, you're looking at an immediate, non-negotiable extra cost of roughly $3,000 for every single 40-foot shipping container you put on a boat.
$3,000 extra per box.
And that cost doesn't just evaporate. It is passed directly down the supply chain to the consumer level.
This is the absolute definition of a black swan event. It guarantees an immediate, massive wave of global inflation. The products you buy, from raw materials to finished electronics to basic consumer goods, are going to take weeks longer to arrive because they are sailing around the African continent, and they're going to cost significantly more when they finally hit the shelves because of the insurance and fuel surcharges. Widespread, noticeable shortages of consumer goods are highly likely in the coming weeks as the supply chain absorbs this shock.
The economic shockwaves were instantaneous and violent across the global financial markets. Looking at the data from the first few days of March, the immediate reaction in the energy sector was exactly what you would expect when the Strait of Hormuz is threatened.
The oil spike.
Brent crude oil, the global benchmark, surged from roughly $70 a barrel to well over $80 a barrel in a matter of hours. That is a sudden, massive 10% jump that instantly inflates global transportation, heating, and manufacturing costs.
And the stock market's panicked.
In response to that energy shock and the broader uncertainty, stock markets from Europe to Asia plunged deeply into the red. The Dow Jones fell hundreds of points as institutional investors panicked, moving capital out of equities and into safe haven assets like gold and government bonds.
And the commercial aviation sector is in total unprecedented crisis. We mentioned the friendly fire incident earlier, but the broader airspace closures across the Middle East have effectively turned the entire region into what the aviation industry is officially calling an aviation black hole.
To ground that term in reality, an aviation black hole isn't just about closed airspace. It's about the weaponization of the electromagnetic spectrum.
The
GPS spoofing and electronic warfare being utilized by both sides to misdirect incoming missiles are so incredibly intense over the Gulf right now that commercial airliners literally cannot trust their own navigation instruments. The signals are completely corrupted. You cannot safely fly a passenger jet through an area where the altimeter and GPS are being actively manipulated by military-grade jamming.
So the result is that major, ultra-busy global transit hubs like Dubai International and Doha are facing massive, compounding disruptions. We're talking about thousands of flights permanently grounded, crucial international routes entirely canceled, and major airline stocks absolutely tanking on the open market. The physical movement of millions of people and high-value, time-sensitive air freight through one of the busiest global corridors on Earth has essentially frozen solid.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the security forecasts for the next few weeks are highly concerning because there's no clear off-ramp visible in the data.
How long could this last?
Military analysts are warning that this intense, high-tempo, kinetic campaign could last anywhere from 4 to 5 weeks, assuming it remains contained and doesn't spiral into an even broader, unmanageable escalation. And the rhetoric from Washington indicates a willingness to escalate further if necessary.
They mentioned ground troops.
The United States has publicly and very pointedly stated that it has not ruled out the deployment of conventional ground troops to secure strategic objectives or secure the remnants of the Iranian nuclear sites.
And on the maritime front, The U.S. Navy is actively preparing protocols to begin escorting commercial oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz under heavy guard, essentially daring the IRGC to fire on a U.S. destroyer to stop a crude carrier. It's a massive game of chicken with the global economy.
Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, the international institutions are completely paralyzed. The UN Security Council held emergency sessions that only serve to highlight how deeply fractured the international community truly is.
Right, the transcripts just show a completely divided room.
A stark, unbridgeable dividing line. The Western nations are largely supporting the military actions of Operation Epic Fury, framing them as necessary, preemptive self-defense measures against an imminent existential nuclear threat.
While the East sees it the opposite way.
Conversely, the Eastern powers, primarily led by Russia and China, those technological anchors we discuss, are vehemently condemning the strikes as a flagrant, unprovoked violation of state sovereignty and international law. There is no unified global consensus on how to stop the fighting, no joint resolution for a ceasefire, because the major powers view the core legitimacy of the conflict entirely differently.
So what does this all mean? We are looking at an incredibly precarious, deeply unstable balancing act. On one hand, we have a rapidly expanding regional war that is actively, aggressively threatening the stability of the entire global economy through supply chain destruction and energy shocks.
Yes.
We are witnessing a kinetic, highly lethal push for potential regime change that could permanently, irrevocably redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East. And beneath it all, we are watching a high-stakes, real-world stress test of modern military technology, where advanced Western stealth bombers and AI targeting algorithms are colliding head-on with jam-resistant Eastern satellite networks and supersonic anti-ship missile systems.
It is the ultimate convergence of military, economic, and technological crises happening simultaneously. The sheer speed at which this escalated, from the breakdown of diplomatic talks in Geneva to a multi-front regional war featuring decapitation strikes and closed global choke points, is a terrifying testament to how fragile the global geopolitical architecture truly was.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, somewhat chilling thought to consider over the next few days. It's a concept that builds directly on the intelligence we've unpacked today, but takes it a step further into the future of warfare.
The digital aspect.
Right. We spent a lot of time discussing the digital fog that has descended over the maritime shipping lanes, with dark fleets moving invisibly across the oceans. And we analyzed the unprecedented cyber attacks that deliberately blacked out the Iranian power grid and hijacked civilian communications. But consider the implications of the drone strike on that Amazon Web Services data center in the UAE.
It changes everything.
If modern regional conflicts now inherently feature the deliberate physical destruction of civilian cloud infrastructure, and if state actors are routinely using military-grade GPS spoofing to make massive multi-million-barrel oil fleets simply disappear from the global view, we have to ask a profound question about the nature of international conflict.
Are physical borders even the main front line anymore?
Exactly. Are we entering an era where the traditional concept of a blockade, which historically meant a physical wall of gray warships sitting off a coastline to stop trade, is completely obsolete? What if a blockade in the 21st century is no longer physical?
A digital blockade.
What if it is the complete, invisible, digital erasure of a nation's entire economic existence? If a superpower can digitally turn off your country's foundational infrastructure from thousands of miles away, blinding your banks and freezing your logistics, or if a regional proxy group can launch a $20,000 drone to literally burn down the cloud data centers that run your modern economy, is the internet itself now the most dangerous, highly contested, and vulnerable maritime choke point on Earth?
It's a fundamental paradigm shift in how we must view national security. The true battleground is no longer just physical territory or airspace. It is deeply embedded in the foundational digital architecture that sustains every aspect of modern civilization. When you can cripple a nation without crossing its physical borders, the entire definition of warfare has evolved.
It's something to think deeply about as this crisis continues to unfold in real time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We know we covered an immense amount of heavy, complex material today, navigating through dense military intelligence and global economic forecasts.
But it's necessary to see the whole board.
It is. Understanding the actual mechanics of this crisis is crucial to navigating what comes next. Keep asking the hard questions, look past the simplistic headlines, and stay relentlessly curious about the underlying forces, technologies, and strategies that are actively shaping our world. We'll be keeping a very close eye on the data as this situation develops over the coming weeks.
How it started, how it spread like wildfire, and what it really means for all of us. All right, let's dive right in. Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the initial strikes that kicked everything off. Then, we'll chart the incredibly fast escalation. After that, we're going to unpack the economic chaos and the huge geopolitical chess game that's now in play. We'll also rewind a bit to see the events that led us to this point. And finally, we'll try to make sense of the very uncertain future this has created. So let's start right at the epicenter. We're talking about a massive, coordinated military operation that in just a matter of hours completely redrew the map of global security. You know, what's absolutely staggering here is just how fast this all happened. This was not a slow burn. In a single day, we're talking just one day, we went from a targeted air campaign in the morning to the death of a head of state by the afternoon, and then by nightfall, a full-blown regional war and a chokehold on the world's energy supply. Just incredible speed. Now, you just knew the response to Operation Epic Fury wasn't going to be small or contained. It was immediate, it was widespread, and it was designed to prove one thing above all else. This conflict was going to have no clear borders. And boom, Iran hits back with its own named counteroffensive, Operation True Promise 4. And this wasn't just a single strike, not at all. This was wave after wave of hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles. It was a clear, undeniable signal of their ability to project some serious power all across the region. And just look at this list. The sheer scope of the retaliation, it's just breathtaking. This wasn't just about hitting back at Israel. Targets got hit all across the Gulf. We're talking the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman. Even European military bases on Cyprus came under fire. This was a very deliberate strategy to make this an international problem from the very first hour. And as if that wasn't enough, just as the entire region is trying to figure out what's going on, a whole new front officially opens up. Hezbollah, from its positions in Lebanon, declares war and starts launching its own massive barrage of rockets into northern Israel. This dramatically widened the conflict on the ground. Okay, so this whole thing wasn't just about missiles and military bases. It sent this massive, brutal shockwave through the entire global economy. And the reason for that, really, it all comes down to one tiny, critical strip of water. To really get why the economy went haywire, you have to understand the Strait of Hormuz. It's this narrow channel that every single ship coming out of the Persian Gulf has to pass through. And as part of its retaliation, Iran just shut it down. Just let this number sink in for a second. 20%. That's a fifth of all the oil the entire world uses every single day, passing through this one little choke point. By shutting it down, Iran basically just turned off a giant tap for the global economy. And the markets, well, they reacted instantly. We're not talking a slow climb here. Oil prices went through the roof. This immediately started stoking fears of a new wave of global inflation, and maybe even a slide into a worldwide recession. You know, someone in a trade publication called it a logistics manager's nightmare, and honestly, that just nails it. Because it wasn't just about oil. It was about container ships, it was about supply chains, it was about everything that connects our modern world. It was all thrown into absolute chaos, a total nightmare. But, you know, this isn't just a regional war or an economic mess. This is a huge, violent stress test for the whole world order. And for two other global powers, Russia and China, the stakes could not be higher. And this is where you can see exactly what's on the line for Moscow and Beijing. For Russia, Iran is the absolute key link in its north-south trade corridor. It's their ticket to India that gets around sanctions. For China, Iran is a crucial piece of its massive Belt and Road Initiative and a major source of oil. So this war, it strikes right at the heart of both of their biggest long-term economic plans. And listen, their support for Iran wasn't just about shaking hands or making diplomatic statements. In the months leading up to this, both nations were quietly becoming what you could call technological anchors for Tehran. They were transferring advanced air defense systems, top-tier fighter jets, and really sophisticated radar, all of it designed to counter Western military superiority. So that's the million-dollar question, right? How in the world did we get here? This didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The groundwork for this conflict was being laid for over a year, full of tension and escalating crises. And when you look back, you can see all the pieces falling into place. You had a UN report setting off alarm bells about Iran's nuclear program. Then there was that short, brutal war with Israel that left everything simmering. Domestically, Iran was being shaken by huge economic protests. And then, kind of eerily, just 3 days before the strikes, there was all this talk about a diplomatic deal being within reach. It really was the perfect storm. And all of that brings us to today. Those first 72 hours are over, and the whole world is basically standing on a knife's edge, trying to deal with this new, incredibly unpredictable, and frankly, dangerous reality. So, okay, why should you care about all this? Well, because this is not some far-off problem. Our energy security is under a direct threat. That could mean much higher prices for gas. The supply chains we all depend on are shattered, which affects the cost and even the availability of everyday stuff. The risk of a direct clash between major world powers is now higher than it's been in a long, long time. And we've all just seen how fast military attacks can turn into economic warfare that hits every single one of us in the wallet. And that leaves us with the one massive question we all have to grapple with now. As the dust from these first 72 hours starts to settle, we have to ask ourselves, are we just watching a regional conflict spin out of control? Or are we actually witnessing the violent, chaotic birth of a brand new global order?